So it's 2:45 on a snowy afternoon. I'm not used to holding a microphone. I work at a university called the University. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the work that I do there. That town up in the very far north corner is the town of the. That's where I work. When I left there yesterday, it was minus in Celsius, which it was actually minus 50, but I say minus 40 because before the wind chill it was minus 50, and minus 40 Celsius is equal to minus 40 Fahrenheit. So how cold that might be. Live there. Now that means that this is Canada with the United States, the Montana, and North Dakota below it. So the wheat growing area is the northernmost area of the Great Plains. So the towns delineated there, Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Edmonton, effectively about 100 kilometers north of that will be the end of the Great Plains forest. And we grow in Alberta about 6 million acres, Saskatchewan about 12, and in Winnipeg about 6 million acres as well. We have a very paternalistic system in Canada, whereby if we want to release a variety, it has to be tested in all 3 prairie provinces over 3 years in about 30 to 50 testing environments, and all of those are conventional. So while I have been working in organic wheat, organic agriculture for the 11 years I've been at the University of Alberta, we're not really allowed to release a variety organic. Now, what I'd like to do is talk about some of the work that we've been doing. I'm a very small program compared to some of the very larger programs. And there's 2 basic university programs, one at Saskatoon and one at Edmonton, working in spring wheat. Whereas the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada system has a really large network. But we are a public system, and so we work collaboratively and cooperatively. And up until this year, where our present very right-wing government got rid of the wheat board as of this year, we've been operating under a very paternalistic an entire government structure. Now, I'm going to be talking about some work that some of my students have done, and I'm going to cherry pick a little work that we've done for the last. These are students who have graduated and moved on. Ali, Heather, Corey, Amy, Todd, and Alice. Heather actually came to work at Montana State, so we exported her. And these other 3 are students who are presently doing work on organic stuff at the Bouvet. We've had, since I started, about 11 acres where we've been doing work on organic, and we don't certify that because we want to play around with it, but it's to manage organic the whole time. We also do trials and work on organic farms. That's what our organic land looks like, and that's conventional, and I'm sure we'll say that So that was part of some trials that we did on competitive. But to show that our organic land is not managed greatly, but it is a fantastic weed environment. So we do have a lot of. I've been getting some money from the federal government to do organic work, and I have done so for 10 years. It's not a lot of money, but some. And the objective for hypothesis of that work is to develop an ideal body type spring bred wheat and organics, to understand the genetic mechanisms of competitive ability, and to develop long-term agronomic strategies for organic production. And here's some of the dogma. This is a slide I think I probably did about 8 years ago. And here's some of the common dogma that encountered when I first started working on this. That's the older varieties. The low input environments, they may be more competitive and use lower nutrients. And then asking a question, where do we for organic? Now, here's some work then that one of, he was a postdoc at that time, Ali, he's now a bean reader. dissected 470 odd yield trials and did a bunch of fancy statistics and found out that location, or where the plant was growing, was the main contributor to yield in wheat. In other words, 67 to 98% of the variation was to do with where it was growing. On the Great Plains of Canada, that means whether it had rain or not at that particular location, or whether the soil was good or bad with the rain. So the environment plays a huge role, and the genotype actually played a very small role, only about 9 to 21% of the variation. However, there were some varieties, Nicoa, Catechua, Laura, Teal, Berry, Superb, that tended to became vast swaths of varieties that were grown on the prairies. Berry, for example, was grown on about 10 million acres. Very bad concept organically, but it happened. And one reason it happened was we found out that these lines were very stable. They didn't perform great in great years, but they didn't perform lousy in lousy years. So this could give you some idea that perhaps we should be breeding specifically in organic environments because the location is such an important part of variation, or the weather is such an important part of variation. Or it could tell you that we shouldn't be breeding at all because the genotype actually makes not very much difference. So there is that corollary to that sort of story as well. Another thing that we did in 2001 was we surveyed farmers, and we found out that farmers thought weeds, fertilizer, etc., rotations were really important things that needed to be researched for organic farms. And there's about 2,000 to 5,000 organic farmers on the Canadian prairies. They are not what Steve was talking about from this particular part of the world. They're not small-scale farmers. They're generally average about 2 square miles of land. So they're different farmers. And there is a question, in my mind especially, of whether that type of agriculture is sustainable or not. They're using tillage masses. So whether that's sustainable. But what we found out when we did the survey of farmers was that they weren't really that interested in cultivars all that much. So this is now, in the rest of the 10 minutes I have, I'll stop myself because I have too many slides as usual. But what we're going to, I'm going to talk about some of the things that we've done after we found out that nobody really cares what we do, which is really good if you live in the very far north, where nobody really wants to go unless you want to make a quick buck out of oil. And we've done, and I spelled mixtures wrong, I realized that I'm not really, but we've done a number of work on different types of things that you would do organically, and actually they've been talked about quite extensively here, but we're in a different environment. So all these types of things, and I'm going to cherry pick a bit today to talk about what an ideal body type is for wheat and organics, and to talk about why we don't really need plant breeding for organics, etc. Just because it's about plant breeding, I said before. So here's Heather. And for example, for the, I was asked, or we were told or something, to write a paper for the proceedings. And so actually all I did was take the abstracts from 4 PhD theses and just do a bit of correction on them, do a bit of editing on them, and that's what's presented there. So I'm just stealing from my students' framework. In fact, this is the slide Heather presented. She grew some sampling of historical and modern cultivars on many different organic and conventional soils. Here's one of the earliest spring wheat variety grown in Canada, Red Fife. And you can see that it's much later and much taller, and it's susceptible to basically every rust known to Western Canada. But what she found out in doing that study on many organic sites, etc., was that ideal body type for an organic spring wheat would be one that's somewhat slightly taller. It has fast early season growth, early maturity, and a great number of fertile tillers. Early maturity was always a big determinant of how good a wheat plant did in my particular region of the world. That might be because it escapes weeds, but it might also be that it's an important determinant of how a plant behaves under a really short climate system. We average about 90 to 95 days frost-free. So we're in an extremely cold environment. You might wonder why anybody lives there. It's because my grandfather moved there, not because I wanted. But nevertheless. Another thing that we did was we grew some historical and elite cultivars and grew them at single and doubled seeding rates on a number of organic lands. And we found that you double the seeding rate, you increase yield, but you also increase weed biomass. So simply, the simple fact, and this has been done on about 4 or 5 pan-Canadian studies, by increasing seeding rates on organic lands, 25%, 50%, or 100%, you're basically, if the seed's cheap, you're doubling your ability to suppress weeds on organic land. And it's regardless of cultivar. And so cultivar becomes less significant than, in fact, the agronomic strategy. So it's effective in suppressing weeds, and it doesn't matter the cultivar. Another study Heather did in all sorts of different weeding environments, we found that tallness, early heading maturity associated with weed suppression. We found that older cultivars were more yield stable, but the semi-dwarf cultivars could yield better and perform better, but they tended to be less weed stable. In other words, they promoted the proliferation of weeds. And the weeds got ahead of them, etc. We've done a number of base studies, etc., on different comparisons of organic, conventional, and varieties within organic and conventional. Which one's on the left? Or left? Is that organic or is that conventional? That's organic, yes. We found that on organic land, they tended to be less strong, is how the term for the quality, and therefore the bread made out of it was more dense. And we also did taste tests and sensory evaluation and economic tests on that, and found that people can't really tell the difference between the taste of organic land. This is in trained sensory evaluation. There would be people that would argue with me quite heavily on that, and I would agree with those people arguing with, because there is a taste difference, I believe. However, in studies that we've done, we found people couldn't tell the difference in taste, but if they were told, if they believed that organic was better, either ecologically or just because, they tended to like it more. Yeah. That was milk flour. Yes, it was whole wheat milk flour, yeah. But and I believe that there's definite differences in that food strategy. Good one. So here's another one. You actually came up to Edmonton and was the defender or the external examiner for this thesis, and we grew a population on many different organic and conventional sites. So here's the organic site, I believe, and we grew a genetic population. So all the babies off of one cross, we grew in many different areas. And trying to answer the question, should spring wheat breeding on organically managed systems be conducted on managed land? And the answer was yes, further. There were selection differences in the conventional and the organic, but there were some that were in common. And one thing that we found out after a long-term study, and we've actually done 3 mapping population studies, 3 population studies, was that the information from conventional yield trialing thereafter is valid to some extent in the organic system. We're not talking about systems totally devoid of context with one another. Perhaps I have 2 minutes, so I will briefly get into that then by skipping through many of the other slides now, which is that we did studies on the underground stuff of plants, and We've also done studies on the micronutrients of plants and found that in organic systems we have elevated levels of selenium and copper, but in the organic system we had elevated levels of zinc and other of the antioxidants, etc. But one thing that we found out there was that in the conventional breeding, in the Canadian context, we cannot release a variety unless it passes quality testing in Canada. And that quality testing is this evil quality team at the registration meetings who basically fail everything. And so all our hard red spring wheat, which is basically all exported, is exported at a premium because it has really good protein. One reason it has really good protein and really good baking quality is because we're growing it in a cold desert, so the protein is high. Another reason is we've been breeding for quality at the expense of almost everything else the whole time that we've been doing it, which is why I talk only about yield here. But we've been breeding for quality. In the process of doing that, we have not, contrary to the soft wheats and the high yield wheats in the United States that Murphy has written about, we've kept our micronutrients in the hard red spring wheat. And we've also, according to this study, the higher yielding Canadian wheats tend to be mycorrhizal dependent. In other words, have been able to use the mycorrhizal associations in the soil in conventional environments very well as well. Even though in organic, what we found is that the soil flora biota is much more diverse or rich in organic. And so I think I'll just leave it there then, as my 15 minutes is up.